Emily Thompson was just another invisible waitress amidst the elite of New Orleans, until one scandalous night changed her destiny. A ring thrown into the sea hides secrets that could alter lives. Now, she faces dangers she never imagined, in search of the hidden truth. The sun was beginning to set over New Orleans, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink that reflected on the calm waters of Malibu Beach. The colonial mansion of the Harringtons, with its white walls and antique windows, was especially illuminated that night. Luxurious cars stopped one after another in front of the main gate, dropping off elegantly dressed guests who climbed the marble staircase toward the party that promised to be the event of the year. Emily Thompson adjusted her black and white waitress uniform while discreetly observing the commotion through one of the kitchen windows. At 25, she was already accustomed to working at high society events, always behind the scenes, always invisible to those she served. Her curly hair was tied up in an impeccable bun, and her starched apron bore a few drops of sweat from the intense work of the past few hours. "Emily, another tray of canapés for the main hall," shouted Chef Jean-Luc, a Frenchman who ran the kitchen with military precision. She quickly grabbed the tray and headed to the hall, where the soft music of a string quartet mingled with the hum of conversations. The room was filled with important people, politicians, business people, socialites, all dressed in their finest clothes and displaying jewelry that sparkled under the crystal chandeliers. Emily moved among them like a shadow, offering delicate canapés and smiling politely, while her ears caught fragments of conversations about business, politics, and most of all, the host of the evening. Charles Harrington stood near one of the balconies, holding a champagne flute that seemed untouched. Tall, with his 32 well-lived years etched into his striking features, he was the embodiment of power and wealth. His custom Italian suit contrasted with the restlessness in his gaze, something that didn't go unnoticed by Emily, who had served enough events to recognize when something was amiss in that world of appearances. Beside him, Adrienne Sullivan. His fiancée smiled mechanically at the guests. Her designer red dress hugged her curves elegantly, but there was a noticeable tension between the couple. Emily noticed how they barely looked at each other, how they maintained a subtle but perceptible distance from one another. "They say she's involved in a very serious scheme," whispered one of the waitresses to Emily as they restocked their trays in the pantry. "I overheard some guests saying her family is under investigation." Emily simply nodded, quickly returning to the hall. It wasn't in her nature to engage in gossip, no matter how tempting. Her grandmother, Grandma Lucy, always said, "Attentive. Ears and a closed mouth keep the job secure." And she really needed that job, especially now that her grandmother required increasingly expensive medical treatments. The night wore on, and the atmosphere in the hall grew increasingly tense. Emily noticed when Rodrigo Fields, a well-known rival of the Harringtons in the hotel industry, entered the room. Tall, with graying hair and a calculated smile, he greeted a few guests before strategically positioning himself near Charles and Adrienne. That's when it happened. Charles, who seemed to have been battling an internal struggle for hours, suddenly raised his glass, drawing the attention of everyone present. The hall fell into an expectant silence, and Emily, who was near the balcony serving a group of business people, froze in place. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady but with a note of bitterness that made Emily shiver. "I thank you all for being here tonight, which should have been a celebration. However, I cannot in good conscience continue with this charade." Whispers began to ripple through the hall like waves. Adrienne, standing beside him, visibly paled. "The engagement is off," Charles declared, his voice echoing through the now completely silent room. "I cannot marry someone I do not fully trust." The shock was immediate. Emily saw Adrienne try to grab Charles's arm, but he pulled away with a sharp motion. Then, in a move no one expected, he yanked the engagement ring from his finger, a stunning piece with a central emerald surrounded by small diamonds. "This no longer holds any meaning," he said, walking toward the balcony. And in what seemed like slow motion, he hurled the ring toward the sea. Emily, who was near the balcony, saw exactly where the jewel landed. The waters were calm that night, and the tide was low. Without a second thought, she set her tray on a nearby table and discreetly began to move toward the stairs leading to the beach. The chaos that erupted in the hall was her perfect cover. While all eyes were fixed on the drama unfolding, Adrian, in tears, Charles storming out of the room, the guests torn between shock and the thrill of scandal, Emily quickly made her way down to the beach. The night was warm, and the full moon provided enough light on the shallow water for her to search. Barefoot, with the hem of her uniform pants rolled up, she stepped into the warm water. Her toes sank into the soft sand as she combed the area where she had seen the ring fall. After a few minutes of careful searching, her fingers brushed against something solid and cold. Her heart raced as she retrieved the ring from the water. Under the moonlight, the emerald glowed with an almost supernatural intensity. Emily had never held something so valuable in her hands, and for a moment, she stood frozen, admiring the beauty of the jewel. The sound of approaching voices snapped her back to reality. Quickly, she slipped the ring into her apron pocket and hurried back to the manor, trying to appear as natural as possible. Her uniform was wet at the hem, but in the chaos of the party, no one seemed to notice. Back in the kitchen, Emily tried to process what had just happened. The ring weighed heavily, in her pocket as if it were made of lead, not gold. Her mind was torn between what the right thing to do was, returning the jewel, and the tempting thought of how much it might be worth. Enough to pay for her grandmother's treatment, to give them a better life. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Guests gradually left the party, each carrying their version of the scandal to spread across town. Emily worked mechanically, cleaning glasses and collecting plates, while her mind buzzed with possibilities and worries. When she finally arrived home in the early hours of the morning, her grandmother was already asleep. In the silence of her small room, Emily took the ring from her pocket and examined it more closely. It was then that she noticed something strange, tiny marks on the inside of the ring, almost imperceptible to the naked eye. They seemed to form a pattern, but it was too dark to be sure. She stored the jewel in a small music box she'd had since childhood and hid it at the bottom of her drawer. As she prepared for bed, she couldn't stop thinking about Charles Harrington and how he had carelessly discarded something so valuable. What secrets did that ring hold? And what consequences would her decision to retrieve it bring to her life? Sleep was slow to come that night, and when she finally drifted off, Emily dreamed of glowing emeralds and mysterious maps, unaware that her life was about to change completely, and that this night was only the beginning of a journey that would take her far beyond the limits of her small world. If this story intrigued you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. And hit like. Let us know which city you're watching from and stay tuned. The next morning dawned with the sky over New Orleans covered in heavy clouds, as if nature itself reflected the tension of the previous night's events. Emily woke up early as usual, but her thoughts immediately flew to the drawer where she had hidden the ring. Before heading to her regular job at the restaurant in the Grand Palace Hotel, she took the music box and examined the jewel again, now in the natural light streaming through her bedroom window. The marks I had noticed the night before were even more intriguing in the daylight. They formed a delicate and precise pattern, almost like a miniature map. Emily picked up her phone and photographed the marks, zooming in on the image to try to better understand what she was seeing. There was something familiar about that design, but she couldn't quite pinpoint what it was. "Emily, my dear, are you already awake?" Grandma Lucy's voice came from the kitchen, interrupting her thoughts. Emily quickly tucked the ring away and went to join her grandmother. Grandma Lucy was sitting at the kitchen table, her wrinkled hands holding a cup of lemon balm tea. At 75, she still maintained the elegant posture and sharp gaze that had always defined her, but the health issues of the past few months had left visible marks on her face. "Good morning, Grandma," Emily kissed the top of the woman's head. "How are you feeling today?" "Ah, my dear, this body isn't what it used to be," Grandma Lucy replied with a resigned smile. "But tell me about last night's event. It was at the Harringtons' mansion, wasn't it?" Emily hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the ring in her thoughts. "Yes, Grandma. Actually, something quite unusual happened." As she prepared breakfast, Emily told her grandmother about the cancelled engagement, omitting only the part where she had retrieved the ring. Grandma Lucy listened intently, her eyes shining with a mix of interest and concern. "Those wealthy folks always have their dramas, don't they?" the older woman commented, shaking her head. "But you be careful, my dear. The higher the coconut, the harder the fall, and those below can get hurt." Her grandmother's words echoed in Emily's mind all the way to work. The Grand Palace Hotel was located in the historic center of the city, and she had to take 2 buses to get there. During the ride, she took the opportunity to research the Harrington family and the mysterious ring on her phone. The headlines in the local newspapers were all about the same thing. Harrington heir cancels engagement at gala event. Scandal. In high society, Charles Harrington publicly breaks up with Adrienne Sullivan. Port empire in crisis? Harrington Holdings stocks drop after scandal. It was on a society gossip blog that Emily found an interesting piece of information about the ring. According to the article, the jewel had been specially commissioned by Charles's grandfather, Anthony Harrington, from a renowned Portuguese jeweler. The article mentioned that the jeweler had mysteriously disappeared shortly after delivering the piece over 3 decades ago. Anthony Harrington was known for his fascination with historical relics and ancient maps, the article stated. His private collection was considered one of the most important in the Northeast, but after his passing, a large portion of the pieces vanished mysteriously. Emily put her phone away as she arrived at the hotel, her mind buzzing with the new information. While changing into her uniform in the staff locker room, she decided she needed her cousin Julian's help. If there was anyone who could help her understand those strange markings on the ring, it was him. Julian worked as an IT technician at a company near the hotel. During her lunch break, Emily sent him a message asking to meet after work. "I need to show you something important," she wrote. "It's kind of a secret." The reply came almost immediately. "Now you've got me curious. I'll meet you at 6 p.m. at the Harbor Cafe." The rest of the day dragged on as Emily waited tables in the hotel restaurant. Through the window, she could see ships coming and going from the port, many of them belonging to Harrington Holdings. It was strange to think that something as small as that ring could be connected to such a vast empire. The constant movement of ships reminded Emily of the endless flow of wealth passing through that port every day, and she couldn't help but wonder about the value of the jewel in her possession. During her shift, she also noticed unusual activity in the hotel lobby. Rodrigo Fields, the Harringtons' rival who had been at the party the night before, crossed the lobby with his characteristic air of superiority, accompanied by none other than Adrienne Sullivan. The two seemed engrossed in a serious conversation, and Emily made sure to stay out of sight as they headed to the executive restaurant. At exactly 6 p.m., Emily met Julian at the Harbor Cafe, a charming spot overlooking the sea. Her cousin, with his thick-rimmed glasses and perpetually messy hair, was already waiting for her at a discreet table in the back. At 28, Julian was known for his insatiable curiosity and tech-savvy skills, traits that often landed him in interesting situations. "So, cousin, what's the big mystery?" he asked, adjusting his glasses anxiously as Emily sat down. After making sure no one was paying attention, Emily took the ring out of her bag, keeping it hidden under a napkin. In a low voice, she told Julian the whole story from the previous night. "Are you telling me this is the Harrington ring? The same one that's all over the news?" Julian whispered, his eyes wide behind his lenses. "Yes, but that's not all," Emily replied, showing him the markings on the inside of the ring. "Look at this. It looks like some kind of map or code." Julian examined the jewel carefully, using his phone's camera to take close-up photos of the markings. "This is fascinating," he murmured. "These lines, these dots, they have a definite pattern. It's not random. Do you think you can figure out what it means?" "I'll need some time to analyze it better, but I can use some pattern recognition software I have on my computer," Julian replied, already excited by the challenge. "But Emily, do you have any idea how much this could be worth? Not just the jewel itself, but if this is really a map." "I know," Emily interrupted him, nervous. "That's why I needed to show you. I don't know what to do. Technically, I should return it, but you're thinking about Grandma Lucy," Julian finished, understanding. "Her treatment isn't cheap, and with the restaurant's salary..." Emily nodded, feeling the weight of the situation. Besides, there's something strange going on. Today at the hotel, I saw Adrienne with Rodrigo Fields. They seem to be plotting something. Julian furrowed his brow, deep in thought. That's interesting. You know that scandal that was circulating about Adrienne? I heard some rumors at the company where I work. Apparently she was involved in some scheme with important documents from the Harringtons' company. And do you think it might have something to do with those marks on the ring? It's possible. The timing is very convenient, Julian replied, taking a few more photos of the jewelry. Let me look into this further. I have some contacts who might help us figure out what these marks mean without drawing too much attention. As they talked, Emily noticed two men entering the cafe. They seemed out of place, wearing suits that were too dark for the casual setting, and something about their demeanor made her uneasy. Julian, she whispered, discreetly putting the ring away. I think we should leave. Separately, you go first, I'll wait a few minutes. Her cousin sensed the tension in her voice and, without questioning, casually stood up. Call me later, he said, paying the bill and leaving the cafe. Emily waited a few minutes, watching through the window's reflection as the men in suits seemed more interested in her than the menu they pretended to read. When she finally got up to leave, her heart was racing. She took a different route than usual to get home, making several unnecessary turns to make sure she wasn't being followed. At home, she found Grandma Lucy watching her favorite soap opera. Her grandmother immediately noticed something was wrong. What's with that face, girl? You look like you've seen a ghost. It's nothing, Grandma. Emily tried to smile, but her mind was racing a mile a minute. Just a tiring day at work. Later, in her room, Emily received a message from Julian. You won't believe what I found out. I need to show you in person. Tomorrow, same time, but somewhere else. I'll send you the address in the morning. Don't tell anyone. Emily lay down on her bed, but sleep was slow to come. The weight of the ring in her drawer felt heavier than ever, and she couldn't stop thinking about the men at the cafe. Who were they? How had they found her? And more importantly, what had Julian discovered? As the rain began to fall outside, Emily realized she was diving into something much bigger than she had imagined. The ring wasn't just a valuable piece of jewelry. It was the key to a mystery that powerful people seemed determined to keep hidden. And now, for better or worse, she was at the center of it all. The next morning brought a fine, persistent rain that draped New Orleans in a gray veil. Charles Harrington watched the city through the panoramic window of his penthouse in Victory Heights, an untouched cup of coffee in his hands. The headlines of the newspapers scattered across his desk screamed about the engagement scandal, but his thoughts were focused on something far more troubling. His phone buzzed with a message from Peter Mendelssohn, the family lawyer and his closest confidant. Board meeting moved up to today, 10 a.m. The situation is more serious than we thought. Charles ran a hand through his dark hair, trying to organize his thoughts. The ring he had thrown into the sea wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was part of a family legacy that his grandfather, Anthony Harrington, had meticulously built. Now, looking back, he realized how impulsive he had been. At the headquarters of Harrington Holdings, the atmosphere was tense. The imposing glass and steel building, rising near the harbor, seemed gloomier that morning. Charles crossed the main lobby, aware of the stares and whispers that followed him. In the executive elevator, he found Helen Sanders, the company's CFO and an old friend of his father's. "Charles," she began, her voice low and concerned, "do you have any idea what Rodrigo Fields is planning? Besides trying to destroy our reputation?" "Not exactly," he replied, adjusting his tie. "He's buying company shares through shell companies, and he's not alone in this. His ex-fiancée, Adrienne," Charles completed, feeling a bitter taste in his mouth. "Yes, she's been attending meetings with major investors. Something big is happening, Charles, and it has to do with old company documents." The elevator reached the top floor, where the boardroom occupied half the space. Through the glass walls, Charles could see that everyone was already waiting for him, including his mother, Beatrice Harrington, who rarely attended these meetings since his father's passing. "Gentlemen, madam," Charles greeted everyone, taking his place at the head of the table. "I believe we have much to discuss." "More than you imagine," replied Richard Vasquez, the longest-serving board member. We've received a hostile takeover offer. Rodrigo Fields is offering a substantial price per share, and some minority shareholders have already shown interest. This is ridiculous, Charles protested. The company is not for sale. It's not that simple, Helen intervened, opening a folder of documents. There are rumors about irregularities in the previous management, documents that could compromise the reputation of the company and the family. It was then that Beatrice Harrington spoke up, her calm voice contrasting with the tension in the room. Charles, there's something you need to know about your grandfather, and that ring you so impulsively threw away. The silence that followed was heavy. Beatrice continued. Anthony wasn't just an eccentric collector. He developed his own documentation system using jewelry as miniature safes. The emerald in that ring, it contains crucial information about the true origin of the Harrington Empire. What exactly are you talking about, Mother? Your grandfather discovered something during the construction of the first port terminal, something that could change everything. He recorded it all on a microscopic map. Engraved on the emerald itself, it was his way of keeping the secret safe. Charles felt his blood run cold. And why didn't anyone tell me this before? Because, Helen interjected, if this information falls into the wrong hands, the entire family history could be rewritten, and apparently Adrian found out about it even before the engagement. The meeting went on for hours, but Charles' mind was elsewhere, trying to process all the implications. By the end, when everyone had left, he remained in the boardroom, watching the harbor through the windows. The ships continued their constant ballet of arrivals and departures, oblivious to the drama unfolding. His phone rang, an unknown number. The voice on the other end was Adrian's. We need to talk, Charles, about the alliance and about what your grandfather found in Charleston. How did you... Tomorrow, 3 p.m. at the Sunrise Cafe, she interrupted. And come alone. Believe me, it's in your best interest. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Emily was facing her own dilemmas. Julian's message had left her even more anxious. She could barely concentrate during her shift at the hotel, especially after noticing more suspicious men in the lobby, apparently looking for someone. During her break, she received a call from the hospital where her grandmother was being treated. The doctor was direct. Miss Emily, Grandma Lucy's test results aren't good. We need to start a new treatment as soon as possible. But the cost? Emily felt the weight of the ring in her bag. Enough to save her grandmother? Or could this jewel be far more valuable and dangerous than she could ever imagine? The answer began to take shape when she finally found Julian in his apartment that night. Her cousin had turned the living room into a makeshift lab with computers and photography equipment scattered everywhere. Emily, you won't believe what I've discovered, he said, barely containing his excitement. Those marks on the ring. It's an incredibly detailed map of a property in Charleston. And there's more. I've managed to identify some symbols that look like specific coordinates. Charleston, but what could be there? According to my research, the Harrington family once owned an old estate in the area, a manor from the Cocoa era. It was sold decades ago, but Julian paused dramatically, swiveling his monitor to show Emily a series of old documents. The interesting part is that around the same time, there were a series of suspicious bank transactions involving the company. Emily examined the magnified images of the marks on the ring, now clearly visible through Julian's specialized software. This seems to point to a specific location within the property, she murmured. Exactly. And look at this. Julian pointed to a series of tiny symbols. These aren't just decorative marks. They're precise coordinates and instructions. Instructions for what? To open something. A vault, perhaps. The ring isn't just a map, it's a key. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made them freeze. Emily quickly tucked the ring away, while Julian turned off his monitors. The footsteps passed by, but the moment of tension was enough to remind them of the danger they were in. Emily, Julian said, his voice now serious, there are powerful people behind this alliance. It's not just about the value of the jewel. There's something bigger going on. I know, she replied, thinking of her grandmother, the treatment she needed, and now this whole mystery. But what do we do? I think we need to go to Charleston, Julian suggested. It's the only way to find out what's really happening. And maybe it's a chance to get help for Grandma Lucy. Emily looked out the apartment window, watching the city lights flicker in the rain. Somewhere out there, other people were also interested in that alliance and the secret it held, people with power, money, and influence. All right, she finally decided, but we need to be careful, very careful. What Emily didn't know was that, at that very moment, both Charles Harrington and Adrienne Sullivan were plotting their own plans to get to Charleston. A race was about to begin, and the prize was much greater than any of them could imagine. The Sunrise Café, located in the heart of the French Quarter, was one of the most traditional establishments in New Orleans. Its centuries-old walls held stories of countless encounters and important decisions made under its colonial arches. That specific afternoon, as the Bahian sun beat down on the historic cobblestones, the café would be the stage for another crucial moment. Charles Harrington arrived 10 minutes early, choosing a discreet table at the back of the establishment. The place was relatively empty, with only a few scattered tourists admiring the colonial architecture and savoring coffee with acarajé. Wearing a lightweight suit, suitable for the Bahian heat, he tried to maintain his composure while his mind buzzed with the revelations from the day before. Adrienne arrived promptly at 3 p.m., wearing an elegant white dress that contrasted with her serious expression. Without waiting for an invitation, she sat down across from Charles. "You look terrible," she commented, signaling to the waiter. "Let's get straight to the point, Adrienne. What do you know about Charleston?" "More than you can imagine, darling," she replied, an enigmatic smile playing on her lips. "For instance, I know your grandfather wasn't just a successful businessman. He was a man obsessed with secrets, and that property in Charleston holds the biggest one of all." Charles leaned forward, lowering his voice. "And I suppose that's why you got close to me from the start." "Don't be dramatic, Charles. At first, it was just a convenient marriage between two influential families. But then..." She paused as the waiter brought 2 cups of coffee, waiting for him to leave before continuing. "Then I found some old letters in my father's office. Letters from your grandfather mentioning a treasure that would change everything. And that's when you reached out to Rodrigo Fields. He had resources I needed, information mostly. But now..." Adrienne sighed, seeming genuinely worried for the first time. "Now things have spiraled out of control. Rodrigo isn't just interested in the documents or whatever your grandfather hid. He wants to destroy your family, Charles. And there are very powerful people backing him." Meanwhile, as this conversation unfolded, Emily was on her lunch break at the hotel, meeting with Julian at a small cafe nearby. Her cousin had spent the entire night researching the property in Charleston and had important news. "The manor was turned into a cocoa museum a few years ago," Julian explained, showing images on his tablet. "It's open to visitors, but there are restricted areas. And check this out." He enlarged an old photo of the place. "This mark here on the main gate, it's identical to one of the symbols engraved on the ring." Emily studied the image carefully, feeling a shiver run down her spine. "So it's not a coincidence, but how are we going to get into the restricted areas?" "I've already thought of that," Julian smiled, showing an email on his phone. "I managed to schedule a technical visit for tomorrow. I told them I'm doing research on the colonial architecture of the region. They loved the idea." "Tomorrow?" Emily bit her lip, worried. "I don't know if I can get time off work on such short notice." "Emily," Julian gently interrupted her, "I just saw the news. Harrington Holdings is facing a hostile takeover bid. If there's something important on that property, other people will be after it too. We need to act fast." At the same moment across town, Rodrigo Fields was in his office at Fields Resorts, admiring the view of the harbor. His phone rang. It was one of his private investigators. "Mr. Fields, we've found the waitress. She works at the Grand Palace Hotel and lives with her grandmother in the Red River neighborhood. She's being monitored as requested." "Excellent," Rodrigo replied, a cold smile on his face. "Keep up the surveillance, but don't do anything yet. I want to know her every move." Back at the Sunrise Café, the conversation between Charles and Adrienne was reaching a critical point. "Why are you telling me all of this now?" Carlos asked, studying his ex-fiancée's face with suspicion. "Because," she replied, leaning closer, "I discovered something about my father, something that made me realize I'm on the wrong side of this story. And also because she hesitated, seeming genuinely vulnerable for the first time, because someone retrieved the ring from the beach that night, and that person might be in danger without even knowing it. Carlos felt his heart race. What do you mean? Who? One of the waitresses, Adrienne answered, lowering her voice even further. The security cameras at the manor recorded her going down to the beach right after you threw the ring, and now there are very dangerous people after her. At the next table, unnoticed by Carlos or Adrienne, was Helen Sanders, the CFO of Harrington Holdings. She had discreetly followed Carlos, concerned about the meeting. While pretending to read a newspaper, every word of the conversation was carefully etched in her mind. Meanwhile, Emily had made her decision. After much thought, she requested 2 days off from work, claiming she needed to accompany her grandmother to a medical appointment in another city. Her boss, though reluctant, due to the hotel's busy schedule, eventually agreed because of her exemplary record. At home, packing a small bag for the trip, Emily explained the situation to Grandma Lucy as best she could, omitting the more troubling details. "Grandma, I need to travel with Julian to Charleston. It's some extra work that came up, and it could help with the treatment expenses." Grandma Lucy, sitting in her favorite rocking chair, watched her granddaughter with wise eyes. "Are you sure that's all it is, dear? You've been so restless these days." "That's all, Grandma," Emily lied, feeling the weight of the ring in her pocket. "Will you be okay alone? I can ask Miss Carmen to check in on you." "Don't worry, dear. I'm not that bad yet," the lady smiled, but her face showed concern. "Just be careful. I've been feeling a tightness in my chest, as if something is about to happen." Emily hugged her grandmother, feeling tears burn her eyes. "Everything will be fine, Grandma, I promise." By the end of that afternoon, as the sun began to set over New Orleans, several plans were set in motion. Charles, after his conversation with Adrienne, had instructed Peter Mendelssohn to prepare documents for an urgent trip to Charleston. Helen Sanders made discreet calls, mobilizing company resources. Rodrigo Fields dispatched more men to monitor the movements of everyone involved. Emily and Julian, unaware they were being watched, boarded the last bus to Charleston. The trip would take a few hours, enough time for them to review their plans and study the details of the map engraved on the ring once more. "We have to be quick," Julian explained, showing Emily a sketch he had drawn. "The technical visit is scheduled for 10 a.m. If my analysis is correct, the place we're looking for is in the old library of the manor." Emily nodded, watching the night landscape through the bus window. The road connecting New Orleans to Charleston wound along the coast, offering occasional glimpses of the sea under the moonlight. In her pocket, the ring seemed to pulse with its own energy, as if it knew it was returning close to its secrets. What none of them knew was that at that very moment, another bus was traveling along the same road. In it, sitting discreetly in the back, was Helen Sanders, determined to protect the interests of the Harrington family. In her briefcase, along with important documents, was an old photo that could change everything. An image of Anthony Harrington next to an open safe, holding what appeared to be a very ancient book. The night progressed, and with it all those involved in this complex plot drew closer to a meeting that promised to reveal secrets kept for decades. The small town of Charleston, with its historic air and streets that still breathed the golden age of cocoa, had no idea of the storm about to form within one of its most emblematic manors. The dawn in Charleston brought with it the characteristic aroma of cocoa that still lingered in the old farms of the region. Emily and Julian arrived at the local bus station at 6 in the morning, their bodies tired from the trip, but their minds alert with anticipation of what was to come. The town was slowly waking up, with the first merchants opening their shops and the rising sun gilding the historic landscape. "We have a few hours until the technical visit," said Julian, checking his watch as they walked down Amado Street. "We can grab a coffee and review our plan." They found a small traditional bakery, the kind that seems to have been around forever, with marble tables and freshly brewed coffee. As they enjoyed fresh bread and strong coffee, Julian opened his laptop, careful to sit in a discreet corner, with his back to the wall. "The manor was built in 1912, he explained, showing Emily some old photos. "It was the administrative headquarters for the Harrington family's cocoa plantations. When the family sold the property in the 80s, it was turned into a museum. Emily studied the images carefully, trying to match them with the markings on the BU Alliance's map. And where exactly is this library you mentioned? On the second floor, West Wing. According to the blueprints I managed to get, it was Anthony Harrington's private office. Today, it's a partially restricted area used to store historical documents. As they talked, they didn't notice Helen Sanders entering the same bakery. She chose a distant table, but strategically positioned herself to observe them. On her phone, a message from Charles Harrington flashed, "I'm on my way to Charleston. Keep an eye on the waitress." The Cocoa Manor, as it was now known, stood atop a small hill surrounded by well-maintained gardens that still bore traces of the original landscaping. When Emily and Julian arrived promptly at 10 a.m., they were greeted by Miss Margaret, a woman in her 60s who was the museum's curator. "So you're the researcher interested in our colonial architecture," she smiled at Julian, adjusting her reading glasses. "And this is my assistant," Julian replied promptly. "Emily is helping me with photographic documentation." Miss Margaret began guiding them through the manor, explaining details of the construction and local history. Emily pretended to pay attention, but her eyes scanned every detail, searching for matches with the markings on the Alliance. The place was impressive. High ceilings, wooden floors that creaked softly underfoot, walls adorned with period paintings. "And this," said Miss Margaret, stopping in front of a pair of intricately carved wooden doors, "was the Harrington family's private library. Unfortunately, it's not open to regular visitors due to the delicate state of some documents." "Actually," Julian interjected, "the library is one of the main focuses of my research. Would it be possible to take a quick look? I promise we'll be very careful." The curator hesitated for a moment, but Julian's sincere smile and seemingly impeccable credentials convinced her. "Well, I suppose we can make an exception for academic research, but you'll need to wear gloves and not touch anything without permission." When the door opened, Emily felt her heart race. The library was a spacious environment, with shelves stretching from floor to ceiling, all filled with ancient books and yellowed documents. Large windows allowed natural light to pour in, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air. "Interesting," Julian murmured, approaching one of the shelves. "Miss Margaret, are these markings on the shelves original?" As the curator launched into a detailed explanation about the cataloging system of the time, Emily took the opportunity to discreetly examine the ring. The markings inside seemed to point towards something near the ornate fireplace that dominated one of the walls. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made everyone turn. Helen Sanders stood at the door, wearing an elegant outfit and a serious expression. "Apologies for the interruption," she said, her voice controlled. "I'm a representative of the Harrington family. We need to conduct an urgent inspection of this room." Miss Margaret blinked, confused. "But I didn't receive any official notice." "It's an emergency situation," Helen explained, showing some documents. "Legal matters related to the family's estate." Emily felt her blood run cold. From Julian's expression, he too had grasped the gravity of the situation. They were cornered in a room with only one exit, and now they had unwanted company. "I think we're done here," Julian tried to say casually, putting away his camera. "We can come back another day to no one is going anywhere." A new voice joined the conversation. Rodrigo Fields appeared at the door, accompanied by two men in suits. "Not until we find what we came for." Miss Margaret, completely bewildered by the situation, began to protest. "Gentlemen, this is a public museum. You can't just—" "Ma'am," Rodrigo interrupted politely, "I suggest you let us handle this matter privately. It's for your own safety." The curator, sensing the tension in the air, reluctantly withdrew, casting worried glances at Emily and Julian. As soon as she left, Rodrigo closed the library door. "Now," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes, "how about we start by handing over that very special ring?" Emily instinctively backed toward the fireplace, her mind racing to find a way out. Helen Sanders stepped forward, placing herself between Emily and Rodrigo. "This wasn't the deal, Fields," she said firmly. "The girl has nothing to do with this." "Plans have changed, Helen," Rodrigo replied coldly, "and you really should." have been more discreet about following us from New Orleans." The sound of more footsteps in the hallway made everyone turn toward the door again. Charles Harrington entered the library, his face a mix of concern and determination. "Enough," he said, his voice echoing in the silent room. "This has gone far enough." The tension in the air was palpable. Emily, still near the fireplace, noticed something odd about the pattern of the bricks behind her. Comparing it to the markings on the ring, a sudden realization hit her. It wasn't just a map, it was a sequence, and she was exactly where she needed to be. The silence in the ancient library was broken only by the soft ticking of a century-old clock and the tense breathing of those present. Emily kept her back pressed against the fireplace, her fingers subtly touching the bricks as her mind worked to decipher the pattern she had discovered. The ring in her pocket seemed to pulse with its own energy, as if responding to the proximity of its final destination. Charles Harrington took a step forward, his presence naturally commanding attention. "Rodrigo, you have no idea what's at stake here. This is much bigger than a simple business dispute." "On the contrary, my dear," Rodrigo replied with a cold smile. "I know exactly what's at stake. Your grandfather wasn't as discreet as he thought. He left clues, records, and some very interesting people have kept that information safe all these years." Helen Sanders moved strategically, positioning herself closer to Emily and Julian. "So that's why you got close to the old jeweler's family, to get information about the ring." The mention of the jeweler made Emily pay even closer attention. Her fingers had found small irregularities in the bricks of the fireplace marks. That perfectly matched the pattern engraved on the ring. "The jeweler," Rodrigo continued, his voice carrying a note of triumph, "was just the beginning. But the real story lies in the documents Anthony Harrington hid in this manner. Documents that could rewrite not just the family's history, but the entire region's." "What exactly are you talking about?" Charles asked, his voice tense. "Your grandfather discovered something during the construction of the first port terminal," Rodrigo explained, slowly pacing the library. "Something that would completely shift the balance of power in the region. But instead of using that information, he hid it. He created an elaborate protection system, using that ring as the key." As the conversation unfolded, Emily continued, her silent work at the fireplace. Julian, realizing what she was doing, positioned himself to partially block the other's view. "And you think destroying the Harrington family will fix anything?" Helen interjected. "Rodrigo, you're being manipulated. There are people using you to..." "Manipulated?" Rodrigo laughed dryly. "Dear Helen, I don't think you understand. I'm not a pawn on the board. I'm the player. Why do you think Adrienne was so interested in that ring? Because I convinced her. It was the key to uncovering the truth about her own father." It was at that moment that Emily felt something shift beneath her fingers. One of the bricks in the fireplace gave way slightly under the pressure, revealing a small compartment. With her heart racing, she slid the ring into the opening. The sound that followed was almost imperceptible, a soft metallic click, but it was enough to catch everyone's attention. The side of the fireplace began to move, revealing a narrow passage. "Impossible," murmured Rodrigo, his eyes wide. "No," Charles replied, a knowing smile spreading across his face. "That's exactly how my grandfather operated. Always one step ahead, always with a plan within a plan." The passage revealed a small chamber, no larger than a closet. Inside, a single shelf held an ancient book and a sealed metal box. "Emily," Charles said softly, "I think you should be the one to open it. After all, it was you who had the courage to retrieve the ring that night." Rodrigo made a move toward the passage, but the men accompanying him remained still. Helen had been quicker. Her phone was in her hand, and by the look on Rodrigo's face, he understood the silent message. With trembling hands, Emily picked up the book and the box. The book was a diary, its yellowed pages filled with the elegant handwriting of Anthony Harrington. The metal box, in turn, contained documents and old photographs. "My grandfather," Charles began to explain as Emily carefully flipped through the diary, "discovered something extraordinary during the construction of the harbor. It wasn't just antiquities or material treasures, it was evidence of a different history of our region. a history that many would prefer to keep buried. The documents show, Helen continued, leaning closer to examine the contents of the box, that the harbour was built on the ruins of an old quilombo, one of the largest and most important in colonial Bahia. Emily found a specific passage in the diary and began reading aloud. The real treasure isn't in gold or precious stones, but in the truth they tried to bury. This harbour won't just be a monument to commerce, but a memorial to those who came before. The ring I had made isn't just a jewel, it's a promise that this history won't be forgotten. Rodrigo let out a bitter laugh. So that's it? All this mystery over some historical ruins? They're not just ruins, Charles replied firmly. They're evidence of a story that needs to be told. My grandfather didn't hide these documents. To protect the family, he protected them so they could be revealed at the right time when they could make a difference. And now? Emily asked, still holding the diary. Now, Helen answered, we honor Anthony Harrington's vision. These documents don't belong to any family or company. They belong to history, and they'll help retell the true story of our region. At that moment, the sound of footsteps and voices echoed down the hallway. The federal police, discreetly, alerted by Helen minutes earlier, were arriving. Rodrigo Fields realized his plan had come to an end. With one last look of disdain at the group, he surrendered without resistance as the agents entered the library. The following hours were intense. Statements were taken, documents catalogued, and the true scale of the discovery began to unfold. The quilombo found during the harbour's construction wasn't just a settlement, it was one of the largest centres of resistance and culture from the colonial period, with a rich history that had been deliberately erased from official records. Emily, Charles called to her when they finally had a quieter moment. I want to thank you, not just for recovering the ring, but for having the courage to do the right thing with it. Emily thought of her grandmother, of all the worries of the past few days. I confess I thought about selling the ring. My grandmother needs medical treatment and... I know, Charles interrupted her gently. Helen told me about your situation, and that's why I want to make you an offer. The Harrington Foundation, which will be established to preserve and study this historical collection, will need committed and honest people like you. Emily's eyes widened in understanding. Are you offering me a job? Not just a job, Helen stepped closer, smiling, but the opportunity to be part of something important, and of course, with a health plan that will cover all the treatments your grandmother needs. Julian, who was helping the technicians document the contents of the secret room, couldn't help but smile with pride for his cousin. In just a few days, their lives had completely changed. There's one more thing, Charles continued, pulling something from his pocket. It was the ring, now cleaned and gleaming after fulfilling its role. My grandfather wrote that this ring should go to someone who understood its true value, not as a jewel, but as a symbol that the truth, no matter how much time passes, always finds its way to the light. Emily accepted the ring with tears in her eyes, finally understanding that this piece was not just a map or a key. It was a testament to the importance of preserving history, even when others try to erase it. Weeks later, the Coco Manor reopened, its doors with a new permanent exhibition. The documents found not only revealed the history of the quilombo, but also inspired a research and preservation project that involved the entire community. The old library, now restored, became a center for studies on Afro-Brazilian history in the region. Grandma Lucy, already receiving the proper treatment, couldn't be prouder of her granddaughter. In her wise words, she summed up the entire adventure. Sometimes, my dear, destiny places a jewel in our hands not for its value in gold, but for its power to tell stories that need to be heard. Emily now coordinated the educational program of the foundation, turning the discovery into accessible lessons for schools and visitors. The ring, which had once almost been lost at sea, held a place of honor in the exhibition, telling its own story of perseverance, courage, and redemption. Charles and Helen continued their work at Harrington Holdings, but now with a new purpose. The company established a significant fund for historical research and cultural preservation, honoring the true legacy of Anthony Harrington. As for Adrienne, she found her own path to redemption by collaborating with the investigations and helping to uncover other stories that needed to be told. And Rodrigo Fields? Well, he would have plenty of time to reflect on the value of truth and history in his new state-provided accommodations. And so, what began as an impulsive act on a night of celebration turned into a journey of discovery that not only changed individual lives, but also the way an entire city viewed its past. The alliance, more than a precious jewel, proved to be a link between the past and the present, between lost and found stories, between people who, even from different worlds, found a common purpose in preserving the truth. The news about the discovery of historical documents at the Cocoa Manor spread quickly through the media. Within days, Charleston found itself at the center of national attention, with historians, researchers, and journalists arriving in the city to learn more about the Quilombo discovered during the construction of the first port terminal. Emily watched the intense activity at the manor through the window of the old library, now her workplace. The room had been completely transformed. The ancient shelves were restored, new climate control systems installed to preserve the documents, and a specialized team worked on cataloging the newly discovered collection. "It's still strange to be here as an employee and not as an intruder," she commented to Julian, who had been hired as the head of digital archiving and preservation. "Technically, we were never intruders," he replied, adjusting his glasses, as he scanned another page from Anthony Harrington's diary. "We were just following a very specific map." The transformation wasn't limited to the physical space. Emily noticed profound changes in everyone involved in that story. Charles Harrington, for example, had become a different person since the discovery. That morning, he was at the manor for a meeting with representatives from the local community. "The memorial project needs to be developed in collaboration with the residents," he explained to a group gathered in the conference room. "This isn't just my family's history. It's the history of an entire region, of a people who resisted and preserved their culture." Helen Sanders was coordinating the administrative side of the newly established Harrington Foundation for Historical Research and Preservation. Her experience in the corporate world was proving essential in structuring something that promised to transcend generations. "The research fund is already established," she informed during the meeting. "We'll offer grants to students and researchers interested in exploring not only the history of the Quilombo, but also the broader social and cultural context of the region." For Emily, however, the most significant transformation was happening in her own home. Grandma Lucy, now receiving proper care at a specialized clinic, was slowly regaining her vitality. That afternoon, after the meeting, Emily went to visit her during lunchtime. "My daughter," Grandma Lucy smiled as she saw her enter the clinic room. "You wouldn't believe what happened today. The doctor said I'm responding very well to the treatment. Who would have thought that all your concern about a trip to Charleston would end up changing our lives like this?" Emily sat beside her grandmother, holding her wrinkled hand tenderly. "You always said that God writes straight with crooked lines, didn't you?" "And doesn't he indeed?" The elderly woman chuckled softly. "But tell me more about this new job. You seem so excited when you talk about it." Emily began to share about the educational project she was developing. The idea was to create programs that would bring the discovered history to the region's schools, connecting the younger generations with their past in a meaningful way. "Next week, we'll welcome the first group of students," she explained, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. "We're going to use technology to make everything more interactive. Julian is developing an app that allows visitors to explore the manor and learn about its history virtually." Meanwhile, in the main office of Harrington Holdings in New Orleans, another transformation was underway. Charles, after weeks of negotiations and planning, was finally ready to present the structural changes to the company's board. "The creation of the Cultural Institute isn't just a moral obligation," he explained to the gathered board members. "It's an investment in the future. By recognizing and preserving our true history, we're building a stronger foundation for what's to come." It was at that moment that Beatrice Harrington, who had been silently observing the presentation, rose from her seat. "My son," she began, her voice trembling with emotion, "your grandfather always said that the true value of a legacy isn't in what we keep for ourselves, but in what we share with others. Today I finally understand what he meant." As the afternoon progressed, Emily returned to the manor for another fascinating discovery. While cataloguing some documents, they found old photographs showing celebrations and rituals held in the Quilombo before the port was built. Among them, one particularly stood out. It showed a group of people gathered around an object that closely resembled the ring. "Look at this," Julian pointed to a detail in the photo. The emerald in the ring. It wasn't just a precious stone. It was a relic that belonged to the Quilombo community. Anthony Harrington didn't turn it into a jewel out of vanity. He preserved it in the only way he could at the time. The discovery added another layer of meaning to the entire story. The ring wasn't just a map or a key. It was a symbol of resistance and cultural preservation that had endured through generations. By the end of that day, as the sun set over Charleston, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Emily stayed a little longer at the manor. Seated in the old library, now transformed into a research center, she flipped through Anthony Harrington's diary once more. One passage in particular caught her attention. True power doesn't lie in owning history, but in allowing it to flourish and renew itself. Each generation has the responsibility not only to preserve the past, but to give it new meaning. At that moment, Emily understood that true transformation wasn't just about physical or structural changes, but about how each of them had been touched by that story. The ring, once thrown into the sea in a moment of anger, had become the catalyst for a change far greater than anyone could have imagined. The first official event of the Harrington Cultural Institute was scheduled for a special evening, exactly 3 months after the discovery of the documents in the manor. The chosen location couldn't have been more significant. The Cocoa Manor itself, now fully restored and adapted for its new role as a cultural and research center. Emily arrived early that morning, overseeing the final preparations. The old colonial mansion had been transformed into a space that harmoniously blended the historic and the contemporary. The centuries-old walls now housed interactive panels that told the story of the Quilombo and the region, while preserving the original architecture that had witnessed so many important events. "Is everything ready for tonight?" asked Helen Sanders, who had just arrived with a team of journalists for a preview of the event. "Almost everything," Emily replied, checking her tablet. "The main exhibition is set up. The multimedia system Julian developed is working perfectly, and we've just confirmed the attendance of all the special guests." Among the guests was Grandma Lucy, who had insisted on attending despite still recovering. "I won't miss my granddaughter's big night for anything," she had declared to the medical team, who finally agreed to her participation as long as it was for a limited time. Tonight's event wasn't just an inauguration, it was a celebration, of transformation and reconciliation. The exhibition revealed memories the Harbour Quilombo would present to the public for the first time the entire collection discovered, including the famous ring, now a permanent part of the historical archive. Charles Harrington was particularly nervous about his opening speech. In his temporary office at the manor, he was reviewing his notes when he received an unexpected visit. Adrienne. "Sorry for showing up unannounced," she said, standing at the door, "but I thought I should be here today." Carlos watched her for a moment before responding. Adrienne looked different, not just in her more subdued appearance, but in her posture, which carried a weight of regret and, at the same time, determination. "You have as much right to be here as anyone," he finally replied. "After all, in a way, your actions also brought us to this moment." "I came to bring something," she said, pulling a folder from her bag. "I found it in my father's archives. They're old documents about other properties in the region that might have a connection to the Quilombo. I thought the research team might be interested." Adrienne's arrival with new documents symbolized something greater: the possibility of redemption and the importance of each piece in the puzzle of history. Emily, who discreetly witnessed the scene, realized how each person involved in that story had their own path of transformation to walk. In the afternoon, as the final adjustments were being made for the event, Julian was finishing the installation of the augmented reality system that would allow visitors to visualize what the original Quilombo looked like through their smartphones. "You know what's most interesting?" he commented to Emily as they ran the final tests. "The more we research, the more connections we find. The Quilombo wasn't isolated. it was part of a complex network of communities that helped each other. The discovery of this network of solidarity had inspired one of the Institute's most ambitious projects, a scholarship program for young people in the region, with priority given to descendants of the still existing Quilombola communities. "It's as if the past is offering a path to the future," observed Helen, who had joined them for the final equipment check. As evening approached, the manor began to come alive with the arrival of the first guests, renowned historians, representatives of traditional communities, local authorities, and most importantly, members of the region's Quilombola communities, all gathered to witness a historic moment. Grandma Lucy arrived accompanied by her nurse, but her energy and enthusiasm showed no signs of fragility. Dressed in an elegant blue outfit, she was warmly received by everyone who knew her story and her indirect yet crucial role in that entire transformation. "My granddaughter," she said to Emily when they had a moment alone, "do you remember that day when you told me you needed to travel to Charleston? I knew something important was about to happen. A mother always knows." The most emotional moment of the night was about to happen. The exhibition had been organized so that visitors would embark on a chronological journey, starting with the history of the Quilombo, moving through the construction of the port, and arriving at the present moment. At the center of this narrative, in a specially designed glass case, was the ring that had connected all those stories and people. The grand hall of the Cocoa Manor was filled with anticipation as Charles Harrington stepped onto the small makeshift stage for his inauguration speech. The soft lighting highlighted the restored architectural details, while the multimedia system developed by Julian projected historical images onto the century-old walls. 3 months ago, Charles began, his steady voice echoing through the room. An impulsive decision on a night of celebration set off a chain of events that would change not only our lives, but the history of an entire region. Today, we are not just inaugurating a cultural institute, we are returning to the community, a treasure that has always been rightfully theirs, their own history. Emily watched the scene from the front row, next to Grandma Lucy, who held her hand with pride. In the audience, attentive faces reflected the significance of the moment, descendants of Quilombola families, historians, journalists, and even Adrienne, sitting discreetly at the back of the hall. "My grandfather, Anthony Harrington," Charles continued, "discovered something extraordinary during the construction of the first port terminal, but his true legacy was not what he found. It was his decision to preserve that discovery, so that one day it could be revealed in the right way at the right time by the right people." Helen Sanders, who stood near the stage, smiled as she noticed how Charles had changed. He was no longer the businessman solely focused on financial results, but a man who had found a greater purpose for his family's legacy. "The Harrington Cultural Institute," he went on, "is born with 3 fundamental missions. First, to preserve and study the historical collection discovered, ensuring that this information is available to researchers and the community. Second, to develop educational programs that bring this knowledge to schools and universities in the region. And third, to establish a permanent research and scholarship fund, ensuring that new stories continue to be discovered and told." At that moment, Charles gestured toward Emily, inviting her to join him on stage. She hesitated for a moment, but her grandmother's encouraging smile gave her the strength to rise and walk up. This story would not have been possible without the courage and integrity of Emily Thompson, Charles declared, prompting a wave of applause. It was she who, even while facing personal challenges, chose to do the right thing. And that is why I am pleased to announce that Emily will be the first executive director of our institute. The surprise on Emily's face was genuine. She had not been informed of this decision, but before she could fully process the news, Charles made another announcement. "It is also with great satisfaction that I announce the creation of the Grandma Lucy Health Assistance Program in honor of Emily's grandmother. This program will provide free medical care to traditional communities in the region, starting with the areas where we have identified descendants of the old Quilombo." Silent tears streamed down Grandma Lucy's face as she now received hugs and congratulations from those around her. Her successful treatment had inspired an initiative that would benefit hundreds of other families. The ceremony continued with the official opening of the exhibition. Visitors wandered through the carefully prepared spaces where technology and history came together to tell a compelling narrative. At the heart of everything, the ring in its special display case shimmered under the lights, no longer just a family heirloom, but a symbol of resilience, preservation, and transformation. Julian, proud of his work with the multimedia system, watched with satisfaction as visitors interacted with the exhibits. Through tablets and smartphones, they could see virtual reconstructions of the Quilombo, explore historical documents, and understand the connections between the past and the present. "This is incredible," commented a young history student, amazed by the technology. "It's like we can actually travel back in time and understand how everything happened." By the end of the evening, when most of the guests had left, Emily found a moment of quiet in the old library. The place that once held secrets was now open to share knowledge. The restored shelves housed not only historical documents, but also new books and research on the region's history. Charles found her there, gazing at the night view through the restored stained glass windows. "You deserve this, Emily," he said, softly. "No one understands the importance of what we discovered here better than you." "It's still hard to believe everything that happened," she replied. "Sometimes I catch myself thinking, what if I hadn't gone to the beach that night? What if I had chosen to sell the ring?" "But you didn't sell it," a familiar voice joined the conversation. It was Grandma Lucy, who had insisted on making one last visit to the library before heading home. "You chose to follow your heart, my dear, and look where it has brought us." The three of them stood in silence for a moment, watching the lights of Charleston through the manor's windows. Outside, the world continued its normal course, but inside, something extraordinary had happened. A story that had been hidden for decades had finally found its way into the light. "You know," said Grandma Lucy, her voice filled with wisdom, "sometimes the real treasure isn't what we're searching for, but what we discover about ourselves along the way." Emily hugged her grandmother, feeling a deep gratitude for everything they had experienced. The ring that had once been thrown into the sea in a moment of anger had become so much more than a valuable jewel. It was a reminder that the truth, when preserved with love and revealed with courage, has the power to transform not just individual lives, but entire generations. The Harrington Cultural Institute would become a landmark in the preservation of the region's history and culture, an example of how the past, when properly honored and studied, can illuminate the path to a more just and inclusive future. And it all began with a choice, the choice of a young waitress who, even in the face of hardship, decided to do the right thing. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Emily and the mysterious secret of the Harrington ring has touched your hearts. To continue this journey of exciting discoveries, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories. Find it here by clicking on your left. If you enjoyed this narrative, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give the video a like. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of life and the transformative power of truth. Don't miss our upcoming content and share your thoughts on this tale of courage, integrity, and redemption in the comments. We look forward to reading your feedback.